we need a very clear understanding of what we mean by societal well-being, or what are our societal goals, and those goals have to include human well-being, both material and non-material, the well-being of other living organisms, the idea of equity, that it is distributed across this generation in a fair manner, and the idea of sustainability, that is over time. And finally, also the question of how we decide.
Welcome to the Case for Conservation podcast, where we explore biodiversity conservation and the environment more broadly and interrogate conventional wisdom for the sake of a more robust case for conservation. I'm your host, Andre Marder. Half a century ago, a group of more than 2,000 scientists signed a warning of environmental crisis and nuclear war. Named after the French town where it was compiled, the Menton Message turned out to be somewhat hyperbolic in its environmental predictions, and it did not account for some of humankind's remarkable developmental progress over the following decades. But some of its concerns certainly remain prescient today. And so another smaller group of scientists convened on the 50-year anniversary of the Menton Message to revisit and modernize some of its assertions. The resulting document is a letter to fellow citizens of Earth, which was also summarized in an article for the journal Nature. It makes 3 key points. 1, individualistic, materialistic, exploitative short-term thinking has led us to lose sight of the public good. 2, a focus on economic growth distracts from achieving well-being and happiness and destroys our shared resources. 3, current economic, political, and social institutions are failing us. Although the new letter acknowledges some of the progress that we've made since the Menton Message, it emphasizes the threats and asserts the urgent need for change. Sharachchandra Lele, who's appeared on the podcast in the past in episode 17, is one of the 2 main authors of the 2022 letter and the Nature article. I pushed him on the accuracy of some of the letter's claims and assertions. The resulting conversation interrogates different aspects of the letter and questions the idea that we are on completely the wrong track to make things right. Our conversation jumps around a bit and doesn't follow the sequence of the letter, but as I just indicated, it's also about more than just the letter. It's about the notion that we need to drastically change the way that we run the planet, and perhaps even more importantly, how we affect those changes. This episode and episode 48 with Ron Bailey function as sort of counterpoints to each other, and I'd really suggest that you consider listening to them as a set. Sharad begins by explaining how the letter appeals to people's values.
Individualism or materialism as a way of thinking, or as a set of values, are not glorified in really any society, broadly speaking, till recent times. All religions subscribe to the idea of, helping your neighbor, caring for your community, living a simple life, not pursuing material pleasures, because that is not the pathway to happiness. So we've had a long history of thinking on those lines, but it's only in recent time that the idea of individual pursuit of material well-being at the cost of everything else has been kind of glorified, through modern economic or neoclassical thinking. And the point being made here is that, that's the fundamental prerequisite for having a sustainable and equitable society, is that people's values have to be broader than individual well-being, number one, and recognition that individual well-being is not the same as unlimited individual material consumption. And that it is not true that more consumption means more well-being. And it is, in any case, not appropriate from a values perspective to only about one's own well-being without worrying about the well-being of larger society. So it's a direct appeal to people's values and championing a different set of values, a discussion which can't be refuted on empirical grounds. So yes, it may be true that in some societies, when some people become wealthy, they give more to philanthropy. But the question remains, is that the kind of society we want where the poor are living on the charity of the rich? So that becomes a value question, and that's not something that can be, refuted through a discussion of either environmental Kuznets curve, where once societies get rich, they spend more on environmental protection, or a social Kuznets curve, where richer societies spend more on philanthropy or something like that. Because the core question here is about values. Do we want to pursue richness? Do we want to particularly pursue material well-being at the cost of everything else? Or is happiness something different? And in our set of values or goals, is individual happiness, the only goal that people should be pursuing? So equity is, in a sense, in this letter, is a normative concern. It's not something that is an instrument for something else. Because once we get into that discussion, then of course you can say, well, some amount of inequity actually helps or hinders, or then they become sort of an empirical debate about how much inequity can be tolerated. Maybe sometimes it is useful, but it's within a very narrow framing of the question. One question is about complicity. So, I think that's central. This particular part of the letter is focusing on agency without claiming that all individual values are self-given or self-achieved, and acknowledging the role of structure. But this is perhaps the part where we focus more on individual agency and say values have to change and people have to take responsibility for their values, without ignoring the fact that values are hugely shaped by the structures within which we live. So I think that point is a really important one. The question of own complicity. In fact, the letter is kind of starting with our own complicity and then saying, well, but we also recognize that our consumerist values or our individualistic values are the product of social structure as well, or are influenced heavily by social structure. I think that's a very important point to cover. And the third one also, obviously, that individualism and innovation, or exploitativeness help us progress. So these are kind of some myths out there, or which can be empirically justified or empirically supported once we define human well-being in a very narrow sense, and mostly for the elite. So the rest of the society is surviving. Some people are really benefiting, and possibly the whole pie is enlarging. You could very well argue, for instance, that the poor in India today are better off than the poor in India 50 years ago because of economic growth. Yes, that's probably true to an extent, but the gap between the rich and poor is 10 or 20 times wider than it was, let's say, 50 years ago. That's point number one. And point number two, is this entire package environmentally sustainable in the long run? No. And point number three, that the poor are also bearing the brunt of environmental harm on a daily basis, which they didn't have to do to that extent 50 years ago. So I think the answer is really that we can glorify individualism as the engine of development if we define development very narrowly.
Mm-hmm. The case for, let's say, capitalism helping to raise people out of poverty, I would state even more strongly than you did just now. I think that it's undeniable that that's been the case, but whether it's been good for nature is a much more difficult argument to make. And I mean, there have been arguments for that. For example, in countries that have adopted extreme forms of socialism, have been more environmentally ruinous than most capitalist countries. So communism doesn't seem to have done any better than capitalism, but still, capitalism has a lot to answer for when it comes to damaging the environment.
So I think that's perhaps at the core of some of the debate and discussion we've been having over the last 6 months. So we should spend time on that. And my response is probably going to be that I think we have a very simplistic understanding of both capitalism and its alternatives. We sort of cast them as capitalism versus communism, and we see communism as it historically unfolded in one part of the world as the only alternative we might have. And that the critique of capitalism is both environmental as well as social. And we live in a world of incredible inequity, and that's clearly the outcome of capitalism, not socialism. If socialism has failed, It's because it targeted equity, but it did so without really getting at perhaps some of the roots of capitalism, and B, certainly ignored environmental questions, and B, it was operating within a larger global context which was still highly capitalistic, and a political context which was going hammer and tongs, trying to break down, seeing communism as a threat. So I think it is important to recognize that without glossing over, the umpteen mistakes that communism made. And I think the alternative to capitalism is not communism. What label we give it is something we have to think about, but because it's a complex idea, what kind of an alternative we would have to build. So it will take us time to evolve towards that. But I think we shouldn't simplify the critique of capitalism as, well, only resulting in environmental damage. Even there, you could say, oh, well, but communist countries did more environmental damage, etc. So the critique of capitalism starts with inequity, actually, as you know, right, from Marx. The critique of capitalism at that point is inequity, not environmental damage. And the response to that is, one response is communism, the other one is sort of reformed capitalism in the form of socialism, social democrat movements, where you ameliorate the extremes of capitalism through some labor laws, some restrictions on capital and so on and so forth, try to limit the extreme societal damages. And there have been others who have tried to be more bold, but have worked in a microcosm surrounded by, of course, a very vigorous attack from capitalism. So, and it's the subsequent environmental critique that has sort of doubly charged capitalism with the problem of environmental damage. And you can argue that it is a critique of industrialism, and therefore it applies to state-led industrialism as much as to private capital-led industrialism. And so that's why the critique is complicated. That is it really the Industrial Revolution that gave both these benefits and all these damages? And if so, was it inevitable, or was it inevitable because Industrial Revolution coincided with and worked hand in glove with colonialism and then capitalism, hyper-capitalism or industrial capitalism? So these are complicated questions, and I cannot obviously cover them in too much detail, but that's kind of how I would probably respond, saying that it's a double critique of capitalism, really. Even the letter subscribes to, but goes beyond, in the sense that it also says that capitalism is one of the problems. It's not the only problem. And the root causes identified in the letter, we have sort of broken them into three pieces. But if you look at it more carefully, the third piece is talking about economic, political, and social institutions. So it's really talking about at least three different kinds of structures that are inimical to a sustainable and equitable planet.
Yeah. So I think capitalism and socialism are matters of degree. So, I think to me it's very clear, and it seems like you're also saying that the ideal system lies somewhere along that line, and maybe that's not just a linear thing. Maybe it's not just two poles. Maybe there are other dimensions to it. Probably there are, but more or less those are the main two, and somewhere between lies and I would say far closer to the capitalist side of things, but others might say otherwise. But certainly the two poles are to be avoided. So I think we probably agree on that. But I just wanted so one thing is maybe a bit nitpicky, but you mentioned, communism having failed in one part of the world, but I would say it's more than that. I think so. You're presumably thinking of the Soviet Union, which is the sort of famous example. But there are quite a few other examples. I mean, there's Venezuela, there's North Korea, there's Cuba, and then there are other examples like China, where and it's very difficult to prove this, but it does appear, or at least there's a empirical correlation between the economic growth and the success of China and its embrace of free market capitalism, while still, maintaining their political system. They've managed to do that quite successfully. So just to say that socialism has been tried in many more than one place.
No, that there are obviously responses that, for example, communism took the form of state capitalism. So communism didn't really transfer the ownership of the means of production to communities. They retained the ownership of means of production of the state, and they still believed in the industrial growth model. which is a kind of orthogonal to the question of who owns the means of production, but what should you do with them? Remain the idea that we need more growth to material growth basically, and so you see the environmental consequences, and you see also the roots of the failure of the social arrangements, because state capitalism and community ownership of capital are not the same thing. Um, and community ownership across combined with decentralized democracy could have a very different outcome compared to what we see either in Russia or in China, right? Which is still basically totalitarian in a political sense and state capitalism in the economic sense.
Do you think that that is possible, that sort of community-led socialism?
I mean, it almost seems like that's the only answer. If you look at the degrowth movement in Europe, if you look at a lot of the movements, Via Campesina, and these movements in Latin America, everybody is saying basically that communities need to take control of their resources, but also then come up with a vision of a good society which is based less on ideas of material well-being, more on ideas of societal and community well-being, sustainability, and so on. And that if we spread this model horizontally, that's where we can actually transform things. We cannot do it by, let's say, one more revolution at the scale of a nation state, because it's very difficult to translate a political revolution at such a large scale. It has to be a bottom-up and horizontal spread. The challenge always is to build enough scale, enough momentum that you can hold at bay. It's to give a very small example, right? Let's say I'm trying to bring up my child, and I believe that too much exposure to mass media, television in particular, is harmful to the child, right? Now, if I don't subscribe to TV at home, that I hope that will prevent that exposure for my child. But in reality, if you live in an apartment complex or a condominium or something, every neighboring household has a TV. All that ends up happening is that the child ends up spending more time at the neighbors than at home because of the attraction of TV. So, which means then you need a critical mass both at home and at school, where this message about avoiding mass media is actually internalized, and you have a critical mass of people who buy into that and practice that shutting down of mass media, right? For the children to then see a different way of living and learning. So that's kind of where the individual sort of shift of values, let us say, or perspectives is not enough, and they need a critical mass to which one would call structure in order to enable that to sustain. By the same token, then, if you had a society which, let's say, a community or a village or a town which passed different laws about property ownership or returns on capital and so on and so forth, or environmental laws for that matter, in today's world, they would not survive because they would get just hammered by everything else around them. And so that's become the challenge. At what scale do you need to organize that you can resist the onslaught? That will definitely come, as it has come on Venezuela. It has come on, for example, the Zapatista movement in Mexico, that the mainstream does not like this radical thinking and tries to, demonize it, reject it, attack it in multiple ways. So obviously, there's a need for scale so that they can protect themselves, sustain, keep up the or really have a meaningfully different structure. And I think that's going to be the challenge. But it's not going to be the solution. Is not going to be state-led communism or state-led capitalism or totalitarianism. Those are obviously ideas to be discarded.
Right. You spoke about the attack of capitalism, and I was going to ask you what you meant by that, but I think you've just explained it now. It's this kind of these temptations, basically, that surround us as society, right, to do things that are not good for us. And I guess that advertising is also a very big part, a huge part of that, really. I mean, considering how much corporate budgets go into that, there's a reason for that, right?
I mean, the corporates would be extremely afraid if, society became frugal. And that's really where the challenge lies, because and you can't then just go and convince them that, look, you guys, you're working within the rule of law. And if the law says tomorrow that people, if in a democratic country, people pass a law about living frugally, you guys have to abide by that. But the thing is that their idea of what their mission in life is, which is making more money on money, is integrally tied to the idea of people consuming more uh, and more than they need. So, because if it was just a need-based economy, it would have a very different look and feel and structure, right? So, or rate of production and consumption. So, I think that's so it's not just the fact that the people within the cocoon have to keep these messages out. It's that the people outside the cocoon, or at least the guys with the power and the money, feel threatened by the expanding cocoon, because their way of life, which is not your, it's not your ordinary middle class person's way of life, or the poor farmer's way of life, but the capitalist way of life is under threat the moment you see an expanding cocoon of, well, whatever it is, frugality, commitment to equity, commitment to justice and environmental causes. All of that threatens these structures. And as I said, capitalism is one of them. Political authoritarianism or notional democracies, inequities of power also get threatened by this. Patriarchy gets threatened by this. If you're advocating a society where men and women are equal, they get threatened by this, and so on. So multiple structures that get threatened by colonial structures. I mean, even today, I mean, we live in a world where we say colonialism is gone, but it continues to be present in multiple hidden ways, and it's very threatening for people who have been in power, in positions of power for several hundred years, to the extent that they don't even see it.
So, in response to the second point, and I think let me just read it out here for the sake of the recording. The second point is a focus on economic growth distracts from achieving well-being and happiness. Unchecked growth destroys our shared resources. Similarly, although technological innovation has allowed us to sidestep some natural limits, the belief that we can bend all nature to our will through unrestricted use of new technologies is an illusion. So, a couple of questions here, but the first one is a double barrel. The first one is, isn't economic growth necessary? Admittedly, it's insufficient, but isn't it still necessary for human well-being, a prerequisite for human well-being? And also, can it not be achieved by doing more with less? In other words, being more efficient with our resources and decoupling our impact on the environment?
So I think we have languished under this illusion about the synonymity between economic growth and well-being for far too long. I mean, 1991 is when I first wrote this paper, which was a critique of the idea of sustainable development, and that's become a bit of a citation, classic. But it's not something new. The idea that should we equate development with economic growth? And the moment we say economic growth is necessary for development, it becomes necessary. Then you have to grow in order to develop. And the point is that development has multidimensional meanings, and it's about improving human well-being. And some of those improvements would require improvement in the material level of consumption by a household. Maybe a household that didn't have access to electricity should have access to electricity in order to live a certain minimum level of material well-being, right? So clearly, if we assume for a moment that a certain level of material well-being is part of the overall idea of human well-being and happiness, then it is true that to reach that level of material well-being means if the large population reaches that level of material well-being, that is an increase in the material throughput in the economy. That's a given. What a lot of the research now tells us is that if you look at the amount of material throughput in the economy, 80% of that throughput is being appropriated for the consumption of 20% of the world, of the world's population, which means that you could redistribute material throughput and actually reduce overall material consumption, and still would, people might be above the minimum material well-being threshold. So we are conflating three different things: overall human well-being, material well-being as one component of human well-being, and then the question of economic growth. And the problem is precisely because the second part of your question, which is economic growth, is a very slippery term. When it is criticized by the environmentalists as, oh, more economic growth means more material throughput, which means more environmental devastation. The immediate response is, but no, we can decouple. We can decouple GDP growth from material throughput, right? So the question really is that, is economic growth necessary? No, because you can have no growth, just redistribution, and still everybody will come above the material well-being threshold. So you don't need more economic growth. You don't need an increase in the GDP. Is it sufficient? No, for the same reason, because you could have increases in GDP which only make the rich richer and the poor remain where they are. So then that also does not solve the problem of development or improving well-being. Because when we say improving well-being, we have to very clearly mean improving the minimum well-being of everyone in society, right? That's the goal. It's not about improving, the well-being of a few billionaires. So if the goal when we say improved well-being, it means that of all of society, then GDP growth is neither necessary nor sufficient. And so I think we should turn it around and ask the question, what is our societal goal in terms of human well-being? What component of that would be material well-being, which would be considered as a minimum requirement? And then how do we get there? And then we come to, as a strategy, not as a goal, but as a strategy, we come to this question, will economic growth get us there? And there is enormous evidence to say that, well, if material well-being of the bottom half or bottom, the poorest has improved, it's been as a side effect of economic growth. It's been as a trickle down of economic growth where the richest have become extremely rich and then the poor have benefited a little bit, some of it due to social policies of redistribution, etc., etc. But there's nothing as a given which says that to meet the minimum well-being requirements of all humanity, we need a bigger GDP than what we have today. I think the real question is, if we have to meet that, a much more equitably distributed well-being requirement of all society, what kind of economic structure would be required? And clearly, at a discursive level, we would not be prioritizing economic growth. At the structural level, we would not be prioritizing or enabling private profit over public well-being. So I think that's your sort of a short answer. That it's economic growth is neither necessary nor sufficient, and therefore we need to frame the question very differently.
So, looking at that from the other angle, there are lots of calls for degrowth, and there have been examples. For example, I think the most pertinent of these being during the COVID pandemic, when there was a sudden, and I think part of the problem is that it was sudden, right? The sudden contraction in the economy had a pretty devastating effect on poverty worldwide, or in many parts of the world. So the argument is that that's what happens when you try to stop economic growth, is that the poor suffer. And I think that's true. But I guess that part of what you're saying is that because of the way the system works at the moment, that will have the most severe effect on the poor, which then I guess, and this is maybe an impossible question to answer, but that then begs the question, how do we change the system? It's a very general question there, but I can't sort of steer clear of it at this point.
So I think we need to ground our analysis in two things that I've sort of, the letter is fairly clear about. And I think in a piece that I wrote in the New Left Review, I've sort of expanded on that a little bit more, because it's an individual piece. One, we need a very clear understanding of what we mean by societal well-being, or what are our societal goals, and those goals have to include human well-being, both material and non-material, the well-being of other living organisms, the idea of equity, that it is distributed across this generation in a fair manner, and the idea of sustainability, that is over time. And finally, also the question of how we decide, given that we will always have disagreement on exactly what do we mean by equity, or exactly what do we mean by, how many generations ahead should we be worrying about, etc., etc. We will need an ethic about the procedure through which we decide these things. And those need to be at the forefront of our thinking constantly, that these are 5 or 6 societal goals that overlap but do not fully coincide. There are tensions between sustainability and equity, between equity and individual well-being, and so on and so forth, that we have to keep in mind. That as a good society, we would aspire to all these goals simultaneously. Then the question of why are we so far away from achieving those goals, and the need to go beyond proximate explanations like population growth or consumption simply as as that's the driver, or media are the driver, and so on. to deeper explanations. And what the letter tries to do is lay out these root causes, as we call them, and they focus on the question of structure, the structure of the economy, which is highly capitalistic, but also structure of the political system, which is highly undemocratic, and the structure of the social system. So all these structures are inimical to achieving any kind of a good society. They don't fully determine our values, which is the part of the first part of the explanation, which is one of the root cause is our values, where we have some individual control over them, although they are heavily shaped by the structure. So understanding the question of values, understanding the question of the wrong goals such as economic growth, and so on, and then the structures within which we are all trapped. Question then comes, and this was addressed in the letter: how do we respond? How do we bring about change? And I think one of the key points that was made by the colleagues who were part of this 14-person letter, that the signatories to this letter, was that there's a temptation in the environmental movement to say, well, if I individually can become frugal, or recycle my waste and reduce my maybe carbon footprint by bicycling to work, which are all good ideas, the great ideas, and we have a tough time implementing them. So if somebody does all that, you would say this is a good thing, but that's not going to get us where we want to go. And that was the key point that several colleagues made, which is that we'll have to change the structure. And in order to change the structure, we can't bail out of the structure, but we have to work collectively to change the structure. So, very small example, I would like to go to my workplace, which is 30 kilometers away, by public transport. In the current situation in Bangalore with traffic and everything, it would take me 1.5 to 2 hours to go by public transport and also get polluted on the way because it would be an open bus. So I'm not able to do that, or I feel unable to really meet that kind of a harsh criterion, and I end up taking cars. So the question is, should I abandon cars and go back to public transport? That's one approach. But the other approach would be to work collectively to make public transport better or more available to a larger fraction of the population. And that's where we are missing. There is very little collective action on the question of pushing for public transport. Everybody is individualistically pushing for wider roads, for my car to go faster, and so on. So that's the point that people are making, that if we have to change the structure, which is absolutely essential, of course, we have to first change ourselves. We have to agree to, change our own behavior. But at the same time, we have to work collectively to change structures. And what this letter argues is that we have to collectively work for example, democratic reforms in our countries, changing the economic system, addressing questions of caste, patriarchy, or colonialism, and so on. We'll have to work together, which means organizing. Not going to happen by just me kind of either changing my own lifestyle or even just preaching, to a wider audience. We'll have to go one step further in terms of working in groups, looking for change, looking for opportunities, where there are holes or gaps in the structure for us to kind of push for breakthroughs.
Right. I do agree with a lot of what you said, but I do also think that it's very easy and very tempting for individuals who find it difficult to live, virtuous lives. Very easy for them to find excuses not to do that. Mm-hmm. It's always very difficult. There's sacrifices to be made. But, if enough people do that, then things do start to change. So the example that you gave is a tricky one. I think public transport is generally quite a tricky one. It's a big part of arguments for and against capitalism itself, actually. But, I think at the heart of this entire discussion is human nature, and what are the bounds of our capacity to channel human nature in the right direction. Mm-hmm. And I think the reason why capitalism has been so successful as a wealth creator, even though that wealth is very uneven, the reason it's been so successful is that it completely panders to natural human desires, Mm-hmm. And I think that this is actually another topic, is that the demonization of that aspect of human humankind, I think, is unhelpful. I think it's better to sort of look at it dispassionately and treat it like something that needs to be molded, but not necessarily something that's evil. It just is what it is. That's just human nature. But that will always be there. I guess that's my main point. Human nature will always be human nature, and there are some things that we can't change. So, are we not, fighting against the storm in a sense?
Yes, I think this is something that I would have also subscribed to maybe 30 years ago. Coming from an engineering background, coming from an economics background, that, well, you just have to assume that people are selfish and, profit maximizing or utility maximizing or whatever that economics is telling us. But over time, I think when I see, children responding to cues uh, from their environment, you can see so clearly the nature versus nurture debate so clearly sort of distorted towards the idea of human nature, and so ignoring all the questions about how we nurture, what kind of society we not only aspire for but actively build. And I think it's only over the last maybe 200 years that we've kind of given into this idea that, well, human beings are hedonistic by nature, and there's no getting away from it. There are many examples of societies where from the day the child is born, the cultural cues are very different. It's about community living, it's about sharing of everything, and so on and so forth, where even the idea of, acquisition is kind of ignored. It's not just frowning upon it and kind of demonizing. It's more like building a positive notion of what a good society is, through idea of sharing, bonding, living together, working together, being seen as the way to go. So I think there is such a huge gray area between our understanding of what might be genetically programmed into us. And of course, sociobiology has also helped sort of publicize or strengthen this myth that, human beings genetically are programmed to be selfish. The selfish gene example, the book is a classic sort of illustration of this idea that, oh, to survive, people have to be selfish. And our genes then make us predisposed towards that. I think that's another kind of discourse that has strengthened this idea. Whereas our 10,000-year-old history, civilizational history, has been all about nurture, and how do we ensure that through nurture we actually set up values that are societally desirable, right? So I think there's a big gray area here, and that we shouldn't be falling into the trap of assuming biologically or genetically or whatever human beings are selfish, etc., because I think nurture plays such a massive role that, and in another way of looking at it is that what hope do we have otherwise? So the hope that, in a sense, neoclassical economics gave us, or the hidden hand argument gave us, was you can be individually selfish and pursuing your profits, and yet society will, as a whole, benefit. And that's such a what shall I say, false argument, because it's true in a very limited sense that in economic transactions, if people kind of pursue individual profit, if those transactions are bounded by a very strict set of rules, right, about fair dealing, no dishonesty, no cheating in transactions, no hidden information, etc., then everybody is better off through that exchange. And that's true. I mean, historically, people have been trading things for thousands of years, so there's nothing wrong with trade. But the assumption that more trade is better and more economic transactions are better, and we can somehow everybody can be selfish. So even question was whether when people traded, were they really being only pursuing selfish goals, or were they looking at what the other person had to offer, where that other person came from, what hardship they faced in bringing this to your doorstep, and kind of acknowledging that while you made the trade, right? There's no reason to assume that trade means pure selfishness. So I think that's that switch from placing exchange within a societal context of thinking about the other to an argument that no, you just need to think about yourself, and everybody is better off if everybody becomes selfish. It's been a discursive shift that has absolutely no basis in logic, really, but it's been pushed at us for the last through neoclassical economics, really.
Although I would say that it's not just about selfishness. I think selfishness is there's a certain degree of selfishness in human nature. I agree that nurture can play a huge role and does, to varying degrees depending on culture. But that's just one part of it. And I think that generally speaking, human nature is moldable, precisely by the nurture that you were talking about. I guess then the question is, how do you systematize that nurture?
Mhm.
But one interesting thing related to what you were saying is that I just recently heard about a paper where the researchers found that familiarity with trade and even the proximity to markets and that kind of thing in quite rural societies, the more people traded and the more closer they lived to markets, the more charitable they were in their interactions with other people, and the less likely they were to try to swindle other people.
No,
So,
I don't know
so
the
that
empirical basis for this, but I do know that, for example, Lynn Ostrom and several others have conducted lab experiments on cooperation, for example. And given certain incentive structures, do people get tempted to just behave selfishly, or do they reach out and cooperate with others?
Mhm.
And they have shown that there is an innate tendency to cooperate. There is an innate, hand being offered to the other person. They have also interesting some other, related empirical research has shown that uh, one discipline, people coming from one discipline who don't do that are people trained in economics. So it's sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy, I think, for economists to be trained in this idea of the rational profit maximizing human, and then carrying that out, in their own behavior. There's been a lot of research to show that it's not generally true. People do extend, the hand of cooperation by default, and I think that's something for us to really keep in mind. Mm.
Yeah, I think that's compatible with the study that I mentioned. It was really just kind of
So
like
it's not
the
about charity. Sorry to interrupt, but it's not about charity. It is that when we have to achieve a collective goal, or a goal, we could achieve
cooperative
with
cooperation
cooperation.
is
Yeah,
is a better word, I think.
yeah. So collective action in that sense, cooperation. Um, and that the documented evidence is that people will, by and large, extend a hand of cooperation uh,
Hmm.
rather than pursue their own goals alone. So I think that's the really important stuff to think about. That refutes this idea of people being innately selfish, and points to the whole sort of structure within which we are making these assumptions. Uh,
Hmm.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we're about nature and nurture, right? There's no doubt that both of those play a huge role. And the debate continues as to what
And the
extent
thing is
each of
that the
those.
nature and nurture debate becomes harder at the individual level, because more generally, maybe I'm genetically not good at music, and you can train the hell out of me and still not make me a reasonable, musician. Where you could say, well, it's just not in his genes. I mean, that is plausible. But to say that it's not in that person's genes to care about others, or to give respect, or, treat others respectfully, is to me really, an absurd statement to make. Because I think respect, caring, these are all ideas that we build in our society. They don't fall out of the heavens. We build into our next generation and into each other. And so it's really up to us to push, build them better. Mm.
Mhm. And you mentioned that one of the missing ingredients there is sufficiently democratic political systems. And I mean, you made that as a fairly general statement. Of course, there is a spectrum of democracy around the world.
Mhm.
Again, I would say, the more capitalist countries are the more democratic, even though there are plenty of holes in their democracies. So, what did you mean by that, and which sort of elements were you thinking of?
So I think the question of democracy is more than just the question of whether you have voting rights. And by and large, we have reduced democracy to voting rights. Once in 5 years, you cast your vote, or once in 4 years, and then I have a bunch of elected leaders. At the scale of a nation, where the nation might be Switzerland, or it might be the United States, or might be India, and then the scales are extremely different, right? And if I elect a person to the Indian Parliament, that person is representing, oh, I don't know, something like 2 million people. And that's a completely different idea of even representative democracy than, let's say, a person casting a vote in Switzerland, right?
Yeah.
So that's point number one. But more importantly, I think there is no reason for democracy to be seen only as representative democracy. It can be a participatory democracy, and participation not just in some of those referendums that get held in California, but on a day-to-day basis, people participating in decision making, very actively, which would then mean that the scale at which decisions have to be taken is much more decentralized, which means the political system has to allow for that. So the decision about whether a particular village should be managing its forest in a particular way, you have to leave it to the village and not say that, well, the state knows better and you will do what the state tells you, and we will fell the timber tomorrow because we have a timber felling program or a scientific working plan for timber felling, or that we will then build a dam and submerge 200 villages because that's for the larger, the greater good. So that's the whole issue then is about, allowing decision making at a micro level for people to participate, not just do it through elected representatives. And we are so far away from that idea. We are so far away from that idea of participatory democracy that I think, yes, there is a continuum, but we are talking about a very, at the far end of representative democracy, and just forgetting the where we need to be going, or even if we want to come close to that, enabling a lot of participatory democracy, and then taking some decisions through representative democracy, for example, right? You might say that a small nation might still need representatives to take decisions about defense, about foreign affairs, etc., because those are better discussed at the national level than at a village level, or decided at a national level, right? So yes, there could be mixtures, but currently we don't have any mixtures. All our notions of democracy are representative democracy, and even that representative democracy is extremely centralized. And India is a really good example of a post-colonial society that has adopted democracy, a Westminster model. It's a huge step forward, and yet we have such a long distance to cover before we can say that we are truly democratic.
So it strikes me that, I think that one of my complaints about the general environmentalist rhetoric is that it tends to be very general and very generic. Whereas I think that the way to effect useful change and meaningful change is to hone in on specific aspects of the system, if you like to call it that need to be changed, and specific things that need to be done there. And it strikes me also that one of the, I'm not sure if low-hanging fruit is a good way to describe it, but one of the most obvious areas that in need of attention and relatively specific attention is the whole world of cronyism and lobbying, which I think very much go together. This idea that government and the private sector are bedfellows essentially, and enabling each other to enrich each other, I guess. I think that that is an undeniable problem. I don't think that it's exclusive to capitalism. I think it's probably worse in a centrally planned system, or arguably worse in a centrally planned system, but it is certainly rife in capitalist societies. And going back to environmental issues in particular, there are countless examples of environmental causes that have been sacrificed as a result of these corporate interests, and the lobbying that goes on mostly behind closed doors that we don't know about, the enormous sums of money that are exchanged. And of course, it's the big corporations that can most easily afford to do that. That strikes me as maybe the place to start. I don't know how directly it is related to converting a society to a more participative democracy, but it strikes me as a real glaring issue.
I mean, I would agree with you in the sense that cronyism and crony capitalism, or just cronyism more generally, completely vitiates the idea of democratic decision making, right? Because you are allowing some people with vested interests to influence the decision in their favor. That's basically the essence of it. And you could have a decision making even at a village level, highly decentralized and maybe even participatory, where everybody's sitting around the table and you could still obviously have somebody with a vested interest in the outcome of that decision trying to influence it in a particular way. It's just that it'll be out in the open and not hidden through lobbying sort of chambers. So the danger of individuals lobbying for their to serve their own vested interests always exists, but structures where representatives are far away from the people who face the brunt of the decision, and then stand to gain through the benefits provided by their cronies, is, I think, where the problem lies. So crony capitalism is anti-democratic by far. Uh, does it promote environmental harm? Obviously, it does, to the extent that people who are going to be affected by the decision are nowhere in the picture anyway. So it exacerbates the problems of, and it feeds off the problems of centralized decision making. Is that going to go away with decentralized democracy? Not necessarily, because you still have to deal with questions of capital, because you can't have a political system that is decentralized and an economy that is highly centralized. That really won't work, because if economic power is controlled by some 10 people in a country, who are the billionaires, then it really doesn't matter what the political system is, because they will be dealing with, sort of nibbling around the edges of the problem. They won't really have control over their resources. So these two have to go hand in hand. If political power has to be decentralized, economic power has to be decentralized, which means you have to hugely control, if not get rid of capitalism in its current form, right? Because that's where the power comes from. Individuals who own capital. It's not that the doctors or the engineers or the lawyers individually who are powerful. It's those who are sitting on top of piles of money, which they can use not only for lobbying, but to buy up the opposition to a coal mine, or to buy up a newspaper and make it their own sort of mouthpiece. You name it. That's the idea of centralized economic power. And you can't have a decentralized democracy in the context of highly centralized economic power. So you would have to work on both ends. So again, I think crony capitalism is just a symptom of the problem of centralized political decision making and centralized economic power. So that's the point I'm making, that it's not a question of cronyism works more in state capitalism or totalitarian state capitalism versus less, because we can see that what we thought maybe 50 years ago, that the fourth pillar of democracy, which is the media, will constantly shine the light of truth on all these shady dealings that go on in the political establishment, and Watergate was seen as one wonderful example, etc. It's a minuscule part. They're doing a really poor job, and over time the media have been bought by the very capitalists who are being accused of being of influencing political decision making, right? So the capacity for this fourth pillar to somehow shield us from cronyism is gone. And I think that's where we need to change the structures much more radically.
Just on the media, this is something that fascinates me, but my impression is that the media, obviously it varies from publication to publication, but generally speaking, the number of large mainstream media publications that have been pro-environment, sometimes quite radically so, and so pro-social issues, is far more than it was 5 or 10 years ago. So that seems to have changed in the other direction, or at least that's my sense of it. In fact, I've been quite frustrated by the degree to which the Guardian, for example, exaggerates its headlines. I think that that's causing some harm to the environmental movement. I think it's kind of discrediting it to some extent.
Yeah, so I'm not sure we live in the same world. I mean, I certainly don't see the media in India being either socially or over the last 10, 15, 20 years, you see a decline in their both socially progressive views and their environmental progressive views, replaced by a certain environmental alarmism or simple green, sort of sustainability rhetoric that as long as it doesn't cut to the core of the problem, you can keep talking about it. And I think the Guardian is probably similar. That it's cute, it's nice. They know that people are kind of concerned about, for example, climate change. So it's good to talk about it, but they're not really arguing for systemic change. They're not presenting that kind of analysis, because at the end of the day, their purse strings are, held by somebody else. So I think you will see some sort of pandering to maybe environmental concern at a superficial level having expanded over the last few years. A lot of it is also the fact that with so much social media, which kind of bypasses all the newspapers. The newspapers are playing catch up with all this stuff. So they need
Yes.
some alarmist rhetoric to, make themselves heard above the din. And, environment is as good an alarm bell as something else. So,
Mm.
so I think that's what is happening. But I really don't see this trend the way you described it. I see it quite the opposite. And especially in terms of deeper analysis of the problem, they have lost their capacity for, and we see it all the time. I mean, that it's only some, very differently funded or structured group that is able to, put out different kind of analysis, because they don't depend upon conventional means of funding to do their work. And they remain outliers. They remain sort of these lone voices, or, democracy now in the US, for example, or, things like that. They really try, but their voice, if you think of the voice that democracy now has compared to the voice of, I don't know, CNN and, all the Fox News, all the mainstream media houses, it's so difficult to be heard.
I think actually your point and mine are compatible, and I think that the explanation that you just offered now is quite possibly the right one, is that it's superficial. They lack this sort of deep analysis and practical solutions. What I notice a huge increase in is the kind of alarmist rhetoric that you alluded to a moment ago, which attracts clicks, partly driven by the primacy of social media these days and the competition that it's putting up, against these legacy media outlets who are really not producing very detailed and practical analyses of the problem.
And closer to home, you see a replication of that within academia, for example. That because we are trapped in these structures which encourage number of publications over quality and depth, structures which encourage, puerile academic debate over actually being part of change, so what that results in is that we are after impact factors, we are scrambling after social media attention for, my paper got tweeted some 10 times and so on and so forth. It's extremely superficial. Enormous amount of research on a whole bunch of superficial environmental questions rather than trying to bring about real change through, the kind of knowledge production that is required.
There are two really interesting discussions lined up for the next 2 months. One is an exploration of the new and controversial EU nature restoration law that came into force earlier this year. And the other is another hot topic, biodiversity credits. For the former discussion, I'll be joined by another previous guest, Head of Nature and Biodiversity at the European Environment Agency, Brian McSherry. And for the latter, my conversation partner will be Harrison Carter of the University of Oxford's Wildlife Conservation Research Unit. I hope that you can join us for both of them.